The morning security guard would not look me in the eye as he handed me a small cardboard box containing 12 years of my life, and that was the moment I understood that the family I had loved and served without complaint had decided I was disposable, exactly one day before they needed me more than they had ever needed anyone in their lives. My name is Grant Ashford, and I want to tell you what happened when the people who called me family tried to erase me from the biggest deal of their lives, not knowing that my signature was quietly sitting on every single document that made that deal possible. Before I go any further, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like mine are shared here because our community believes people can be hurt badly and still choose grace, and I promise you this story will remind you why that choice matters. Now let me take you back to where it all began, long before the humiliation of that Tuesday morning, long before the boardroom doors closed on me for what I thought was the last time. I met Vanessa Callahan when I was 26 years old and working as a junior contracts attorney for a mid-sized firm in Boston that handled logistics and freight litigation. She walked into a mediation meeting representing her father's company, Callahan Meridian Freight, wearing a gray blazer that looked slightly too big for her, carrying a leather folder stuffed with papers she had clearly organized herself at 2 in the morning. She was nervous, brilliant, and completely unwilling to let anyone see either of those things. I remember thinking she looked like someone who had spent her whole life trying to prove she belonged in rooms that other people assumed she belonged in simply because of her last name. We argued about a shipping contract for 40 minutes before either of us cracked a smile, and by the time the meeting ended, I had asked her to coffee, and she had said yes before I even finished the sentence. Vanessa's father, Walter Callahan, had built Callahan Meridian Freight from a single delivery truck he bought used in 1979 into a logistics empire that moved goods across 17 states, with warehouses, fleets, and long-term contracts with some of the largest retailers in the country. Walter was a man carved out of stubbornness and pride, the kind of man who believed that respect had to be earned through decades of sweat, and who never quite trusted anything that came easily, including, I would later learn, affection. He had 2 other children besides Vanessa. Preston, the eldest, had been groomed since childhood to inherit the company, and he wore that expectation like a crown he was terrified of losing. Diane, the youngest, had escaped into a career in interior design in Denver and visited only for holidays, content to watch the family business from a safe distance. When Vanessa and I married 4 years after that mediation meeting, I did not marry into money looking for money. I had my own career, a good one, and I loved her before I understood the scale of what her family had built. But 6 months after our wedding, Walter suffered a mild stroke, and in the chaos that followed, with Preston still finishing his MBA and unprepared to step into daily operations, Walter asked me, almost sheepishly, whether I might consider coming in-house to help manage the legal side of the company while he recovered. I said yes because I loved my wife and I loved her father, who had begun treating me, in his gruff and undemonstrative way, like a son. What began as a temporary favor became 12 years of my life. I restructured the company's entire legal framework, renegotiated contracts that saved the business millions, and built a governance system so airtight that Callahan Meridian Freight went from a mid-sized regional carrier to a company valued, at its peak, at $350 million. I did not do this for credit. I did it because Walter trusted me with something he had spent his whole life building, and because I wanted Vanessa to be proud of the man she had married. Somewhere along the way, without anyone officially deciding it, I became the company's general counsel and corporate secretary, the person whose signature was legally required on every major contract, every land title, every merger clause, every trust document tied to the family's holding company. Walter set it up that way deliberately, years earlier, for what he called protection. He told me once, over a glass of bourbon on his back porch, that he trusted his own children to love the company, but he trusted me to protect it, because I had no blood claim clouding my judgment. I did not fully understand then how much that sentence would matter someday. Preston never loved me the way his father did. He was polite in public and cold in private, the kind of resentment that hides itself behind handshakes and holiday toasts. He had spent his whole life being told he would run Callahan Meridian Freight, and instead he watched an outsider, his sister's husband, become the person his father called first with every difficult decision. I understood his frustration even when I did not deserve it. I tried, for years, to include him, to defer to him publicly, to make sure credit for successes landed on the family name rather than mine. It never seemed to be enough. Diane, for her part, remained fond of me in the distant way people are fond of relatives they only see twice a year, pleasant but never truly invested in the daily friction building inside the company. The friction became unbearable in the 18 months before the sale. A logistics conglomerate called Halloway Vance Industries approached Callahan Meridian Freight with an acquisition offer that started at $290 million and, after 8 months of negotiation, climbed to $350 million. It was the kind of number that changes a family forever, the kind of number that turns quiet dinners into strategy sessions and turns siblings who used to build blanket forts together into rivals circling the same inheritance. I led the negotiating team. I structured the deal to protect the family's tax position, to preserve severance for the 600 employees who had spent decades loading trucks and driving routes, and to ensure Walter, whose health was fragile, would not be blindsided by predatory terms buried in dense legal language. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed my own daughter's school recital because I was reviewing due diligence documents until midnight. Vanessa never complained, because she believed, as I did, that we were protecting her family's legacy together. Somewhere in those 18 months, Preston began telling a different story about me, quietly, to his father. I did not know it at the time, but he had started suggesting that I was positioning myself to take an outsized cut of the sale, that my legal restructuring years earlier had been designed all along to give myself leverage, that a son-in-law with too much control over the family company was a liability waiting to detonate. He found a sympathetic audience in Walter, whose health had been declining, whose memory had started slipping in small, frightening ways that none of us wanted to name out loud, and whose fear of losing control of his life's work made him vulnerable to anyone offering him a simple, comforting narrative. Preston's narrative was simple. It said, in effect, get rid of the outsider before the sale closes, and everything the family built stays entirely in family hands. I want you to understand that I did not see this coming, not because I was naive, but because I genuinely believed love and loyalty meant something in that family, the same way I believe it should mean something in every family. I had sat at that table for holidays, held Walter's hand in the hospital after his stroke, walked Diane down a hallway crying when her first engagement fell apart, celebrated Preston's wedding by giving a toast that made half the room cry. I had given that family 12 years without ever once threatening to leave, without ever once asking for more than a fair salary and the dignity of being treated like I belonged. So when the call came from Walter's assistant on a gray Tuesday morning, asking me to come to the main office instead of working from the deal room downtown, I walked in with a coffee in one hand and merger paperwork in the other, expecting a routine meeting. Preston was already seated at the head of the conference table when I walked in, which told me something before a single word was spoken, because Preston never sat at the head of that table, not once in 12 years, not while his father was alive and present. Walter sat beside him, his hands folded, his eyes not quite meeting mine, a folder in front of him that I recognized instantly as termination paperwork because I had drafted templates just like it 100 times for other employees. Vanessa was not in the room. I would learn later that Preston had deliberately scheduled the meeting for a morning when she was out of state visiting Diane, so that no one who might defend me would be present to slow things down. Walter cleared his throat and told me, in a voice that shook slightly, that the family had decided to restructure legal leadership ahead of the sale closing, that they appreciated everything I had done, that this was simply a business decision and not personal, and that my employment with Callahan Meridian Freight was terminated effective immediately. He slid a severance letter across the table that offered 8 weeks of pay, a number so small compared to 12 years of my life that it felt less like compensation and more like an insult wrapped in legal language. Preston did not say much. He mostly watched me, with an expression I can only describe as satisfaction disguised as neutrality, the look of a man who has waited a very long time for a moment and does not want to spoil it by seeming too pleased. I asked, quietly, whether Vanessa knew about this meeting. Walter said she would be informed after. I asked whether this had anything to do with the merger closing in 9 days. Preston said the timing was coincidental, that the family had simply decided it was time for fresh legal leadership as the company entered a new chapter under Halloway Vance ownership. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I have thought many times since about why I stayed so calm in that room, and I think the truth is that some part of me had been bracing for this moment for months without letting myself admit it, watching Preston's coldness deepen, watching Walter's trust in me quietly erode under whispered influence I could not see but could feel, the way you feel a storm pressure change in your joints before the sky ever turns dark. A security officer named Ray, a kind man who had worked the front desk for 9 years and who I had helped once with a landlord dispute involving his elderly mother, walked me to my office to collect my belongings. He would not look at me while he did it, and I understood that this was not cruelty on his part but grief, the particular grief of watching something unjust happen and being powerless to stop it. I packed 12 years into a cardboard box in 11 minutes. A framed photo of Vanessa and our daughter, Josie, at the company's annual picnic. A ceramic mug Josie had painted for me in 2nd grade that said "World's Best Dad" in wobbly blue letters. A stack of thank you cards from employees whose jobs I had helped protect during 2 rounds of layoffs at competitor companies that never touched Callahan Meridian Freight because of contracts I had personally negotiated to keep our route stable. I carried that box out through the same lobby I had walked through 5 days a week for over a decade, past the reception desk where a young woman named Priya, who had only worked there for 4 months, watched with wide, confused eyes, clearly sensing that something was deeply wrong but not understanding what. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I could make myself start the engine. I did not cry, not then. I felt something colder and stranger than sadness, a kind of disbelief that settles into your chest like ice water, the particular numbness of watching your own life rearrange itself in real time without your consent. I thought about calling Vanessa immediately, and then I decided against it, because I did not want her hearing this news over the phone while standing in her sister's kitchen, 300 miles from home, unable to do anything but panic. I drove home instead, sat at our kitchen table, and waited for her flight to land that evening, rehearsing, over and over, how to tell my wife that her family had just fired her husband 9 days before the deal that would define their family's future. When Vanessa walked through the door that evening, she knew instantly that something had happened, because she has always been able to read my face the way other people read the weather. I told her everything, as calmly and factually as I could manage, watching her expression shift from confusion to disbelief to a kind of controlled fury I had only seen a handful of times in our marriage, usually reserved for people who had hurt her family, never for her family hurting someone else. She called her father immediately. I listened to one side of a conversation that grew louder and more incredulous by the second, Vanessa's voice cracking with a betrayal so raw it frightened me, because in that moment I understood that this had wounded her almost as deeply as it had wounded me. She hung up, sat down across from me, and said, very quietly, that her father had told her this was a business decision, that Preston believed the company needed to enter its new chapter without outside influence complicating the family's control, and that everyone felt it was time. I want to be honest with you about what the next several days felt like, because I think honesty matters more than making myself look noble. I felt humiliated. I felt like 12 years of loyalty had been reduced to a line item that someone decided was expendable. I felt a flicker of something uglier too, a temptation toward vindictiveness that I am not proud of, a voice in my head reminding me that without my signature, without the corporate structure I had built specifically at Walter's request years earlier for legal protection, nothing about that $350 million sale could legally close. I sat with that knowledge for 2 full days, turning it over like a stone in my pocket, wondering whether I owed that family anything at all after what they had done to me on a random Tuesday morning without even the decency to wait until Vanessa was home. But here is the thing about love, real love, the kind that survives humiliation without curdling into hatred. I looked at my daughter, Josie, doing her homework at the kitchen table that same week, and I thought about the fact that 600 employees at Callahan Meridian Freight, people like Ray at the front desk, people with mortgages and children of their own, were counting on that sale closing so their jobs, their severance packages, their retirement contributions I had spent months negotiating protections for, would actually materialize. Whatever Preston had done to me, whatever fear and pride had driven Walter to sign that termination letter, the people who would suffer most from a collapsed deal were not the Callahans. They were the drivers, the warehouse staff, the dispatch workers who had nothing to do with any of this and everything to lose if I let bitterness make my decisions for me. So I did not call a lawyer to weaponize what I knew. I did not leak anything to Holloway Vance's due diligence team out of spite. I simply waited, because I understood something Preston did not yet understand, something that would surface on its own within days once the deal team's attorneys began their final document review. That surfacing happened 4 days before closing, on a Friday morning, when Holloway Vance's lead acquisition attorney, a sharp, meticulous woman named Rosalind Fay, called an emergency meeting with the Callahan family after her team discovered that every foundational document in the merger, the operating trust agreement, the intellectual property transfer, the real estate title consolidations, the employee severance trust, required the countersignature of Callahan Meridian Freight's general counsel and corporate secretary of record, a role that, according to every filed document going back 9 years, belonged specifically and irrevocably to me. Walter had structured it that way deliberately, on the advice of his own estate attorney, precisely because he wanted a non-family fiduciary safeguard built into the company's governance in case family disagreements ever threatened the business, a decision he made years before Preston's resentment had fully calcified, a decision made out of love for the company and, I believe now, out of a quiet, unspoken love for me as the person he trusted to protect it. Nobody in that family, not even Walter himself in his declining memory, had fully registered what that structural decision meant until Rosalind Fay's team flagged it in red letters across a due diligence report 4 days before the money was supposed to move. I learned about the meeting from Vanessa, who called me from the parking lot outside company headquarters, her voice tight with a mixture of vindication and dread, telling me that her father and brother had just spent 40 minutes in a room with Rosalind Fay and 3 Holloway Vance attorneys who informed them, in no uncertain terms, that the sale could not legally close without my signature, and that firing me 9 days before closing without securing a replacement fiduciary or amending the governance structure had created what one attorney called, according to Vanessa, a catastrophic self-inflicted liability. Preston, she said, had gone pale. Walter had gone silent in a way that frightened her, the silence of a proud man realizing, in front of strangers, that his own decision, made under the influence of his son's fear and his own declining trust, had jeopardized the very legacy he was trying to protect. I felt no triumph when Vanessa told me this. I want you to believe that, because it is true. I felt something closer to sadness, the particular sadness of watching people you love discover the consequences of choices driven by fear rather than wisdom. I told Vanessa I needed a few hours to think, and I drove to a small park near our house, the same park where I used to take Josie when she was learning to ride her bike, and I sat on a bench for a long time, watching a group of children play soccer on the field nearby, thinking about what kind of man I wanted to be on the other side of this. Preston called me himself that evening, which surprised me, because in 12 years he had never once called me first about anything. His voice was different than I had ever heard it, stripped of its usual careful control, cracking slightly around the edges. He did not apologize immediately. Instead he tried, at first, to explain, to justify, to describe the pressure he had felt his whole life living in the shadow of a father who trusted an outsider more than his own son with the details that mattered most. I let him talk without interrupting, because I understood, in that moment, that he needed to be heard before he could hear anything I might say back to him. When he finally stopped, there was a long silence on the line, and then he said, quietly, that he was sorry, that firing me had been the worst decision of his life, and that he did not know how to fix it. I told him the truth, which was that I was not interested in punishing his family, that I had never wanted revenge, but that I also was not going to pretend the last week had not happened, and that any path forward required honesty rather than convenience. He asked if I would come to the office the next morning to meet with him, Walter, and the Holloway Vance team. I told him I would come, not for the deal, not for the money, but for the 600 employees who deserved better than watching a family feud destroy their livelihoods, and for Vanessa, who deserved a husband who chose grace over bitterness even when bitterness would have been easier and, in some small ugly way, satisfying. Walking back into that building the next morning was one of the strangest experiences of my life. The same lobby. The same reception desk. Priya's eyes went wide again, this time with something closer to hope than confusion. Ray, at the front security desk, looked up and, for the first time since that terrible Tuesday, met my eyes directly, and gave me the smallest, most sincere nod I had ever received from another human being, a nod that said more than words could have. I rode the elevator up to the same conference room where I had been fired 9 days earlier, carrying nothing this time, no cardboard box, no severance letter, just myself and whatever dignity I had managed to hold on to through the worst week of my professional life. Walter looked older than I remembered him looking just over a week before, which I know cannot be literally true, but grief and shame have a way of aging a face overnight. He stood when I walked in, which he had not done in years, not since before his stroke, and he said my name, just my name, Grant, in a voice thick with something between apology and disbelief. I did not rush to comfort him. I let the silence sit, because I think some silences need to be respected rather than filled. Finally, he said that he had made a terrible mistake, that fear had made him careless with the trust he had spent a lifetime building, both in his company and in the people who loved him, and that he understood if I never forgave him, but that he hoped, someday, I might. Rosalind Fay, ever the consummate professional, gently reminded everyone in the room that they had a closing deadline in 4 days and a very specific legal problem to solve, but even she seemed moved by what she was witnessing, a family confronting the cost of its own fractures in real time. I told Walter and Preston that I would sign the documents necessary to close the sale, because I believed in protecting the employees who depended on this company, and because despite everything, I still loved this family, flaws and all, in the complicated, stubborn way you love people who are woven permanently into the fabric of your life. But I told them, clearly and without anger, that I would not simply pretend the last 9 days had not happened, that real reconciliation required more than a signature, that it required Preston and Walter to look honestly at how fear and pride had nearly cost them everything they claimed to be protecting. What happened over the following 4 days surprised me more than anything else in this entire story. Preston, instead of retreating back into his usual guarded distance once the immediate crisis was solved, asked if he could take me to lunch, just the two of us, something we had never once done alone in 12 years of family gatherings. We sat in a small diner near the warehouse district, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, and for the first time in over a decade, Preston talked to me like a brother instead of a rival. He told me about growing up constantly compared to Walter's own legendary work ethic, about the crushing weight of being the designated heir to something he sometimes was not even sure he wanted, about watching his father's face light up around me in a way it rarely lit up around him, and mistaking that light for replacement rather than what I now believe it actually was, which was simple gratitude for someone who never asked Walter to be anything other than exactly who he was. I told Preston, honestly, that I had never wanted his father's approval to come at the cost of his own, that I had spent years deferring credit to him precisely because I understood the position he was in, and that if anything, I wished he had told me how he felt instead of letting resentment curdle in silence until it exploded into a decision that nearly cost his family everything. We did not become instant best friends over that lunch. Real reconciliation rarely works that way, cinematic as it might sound. But something shifted between us that day, some old, calcified wall finally beginning to crack, and for the first time, I saw genuine warmth in Preston's eyes when he looked at me, rather than the guarded calculation I had grown so used to. Walter's reckoning was quieter, and in some ways more painful to witness, because it forced him to confront not just his decision to fire me, but the deeper fear underneath it, the fear of a proud man watching his own memory and health decline, terrified of losing control over the one thing that had defined his entire life. He asked to speak with me alone one afternoon, in his office, the same office where he had once poured me a glass of bourbon and told me he trusted me to protect the company because I had no blood claim clouding my judgment. He told me that in the months before firing me, his memory had been slipping more than he had admitted to anyone, even Vanessa, even his own doctor, and that Preston's whispered fears had found fertile ground in a mind already terrified of losing its grip on reality. He said that firing me had felt, in the moment, like regaining control of something slipping away, and that it was only after Rosalind Faye's team exposed the truth that he understood how badly fear had distorted his judgment. He apologized not just for the firing, but for not trusting me enough, after 12 years, to simply talk to me honestly about his fears instead of letting Preston's anxiety make the decision for him. I told Walter what I believe to be true, which is that fear makes fools of even wise men, and that the measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes but whether they have the courage to face them honestly once the truth comes to light. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it, not because forgiveness was easy, but because I understood, watching this proud, aging man confront his own fragility in front of me, that holding on to anger would have cost me far more than it would ever cost him. The sale to Holloway Vance Industries closed 4 days later, on schedule, for the full $350 million, with every document properly signed, every employee protection I had negotiated fully intact, every warehouse worker and delivery driver's job secured under the new ownership structure for a minimum of 5 years. A term I had insisted on years earlier and that Holloway Vance honored without complaint. Ray, at the front desk, kept his job. Priya, the young receptionist, got a promotion within the new corporate structure 8 months later. 600 families went to bed that night with the same security they had woken up with that morning, entirely unaware of how close that security had come to unraveling because of a family feud they never knew existed. If this story has touched something in you, I want to ask you gently to leave a comment below about a time in your own life when you had to choose forgiveness over bitterness, even when bitterness would have felt justified, because I believe those stories matter, and I believe reading them helps other people find the courage to make that same choice when their own moment comes. In the months that followed, something happened that I never expected. Walter, whose health continued its slow decline, insisted on restructuring a portion of his personal estate to formally include me, not as compensation for the firing, which he understood no amount of money could truly repair, but as an acknowledgement, written into legal documents this time instead of left to assumption, that I had been, in every way that mattered, his son for over a decade. Preston did not resent this the way he might have a year earlier. Instead, he was the one who suggested it, sitting across from his father at that same kitchen table where Vanessa had once told me the news of my firing, telling Walter that I had earned it 100 times over and that the family owed me an acknowledgement far overdue. Vanessa and I grew closer through that ordeal in ways I did not anticipate a crisis could produce. There is a particular intimacy that comes from watching your spouse choose grace under circumstances that would justify almost anything else, and I think she saw something in me during those weeks that deepened her love in a way 12 easy years never could have. She told me once, months later, lying beside me on a Sunday morning with Josie's laughter drifting up from downstairs where she was watching cartoons, that watching me forgive her family had taught her more about the kind of man she had married than any of the good years before it ever had. Josie, who was 8 years old when all of this happened, understood only fragments of it at the time, but she understood enough to ask me, one evening while I was tucking her into bed, why Grandpa Walter had been sad for so long. I told her, in the simplest terms I could find, that sometimes people who love each other very much still make mistakes that hurt each other badly, and that the bravest thing a person can do is admit when they were wrong and try, patiently, to make it right. She thought about that for a long moment, the particular serious thinking face she makes when something matters to her, and then she said that she thought Grandpa Walter was brave for saying sorry, and I told her that yes, he absolutely was, and that I hoped she would grow up to be just as brave whenever her own mistakes came looking for her. I did not return to Callahan Meridian Freight in my old role after the sale closed, because the company no longer existed in the same form under Holloway Vance ownership, but Walter and Preston asked, and I agreed, to serve as an independent advisor to the family's remaining holding company, the trust that managed the proceeds of the sale and the family's ongoing philanthropic interests. It was not the same relationship as before, and I did not want it to be. I wanted something better, something built on honesty instead of quiet resentment, something where Preston and I could sit across a table and disagree about strategy without either of us wondering whether the other was secretly plotting our downfall. A year after the sale closed, the family gathered for Walter's 72nd birthday at Diane's house in Denver, the first time in years all 5 of us, Walter, Preston, Diane, Vanessa, and I, had been in the same room without an undercurrent of tension humming beneath every conversation. Preston stood up during dinner, tapped his glass with a fork the way people do at weddings, and gave a toast I never expected to hear from him. He said that he had spent most of his life measuring his worth against a standard he thought his father had set impossibly high, and that in his fear of falling short of that standard, he had nearly destroyed the very family and business he was trying so hard to protect. He said that the man who taught him the most about what it actually means to lead with integrity was not his father, though he loved his father deeply, but the brother-in-law he had once tried to erase from the family's history, the man sitting across the table from him now, who had every reason to walk away and chose instead to stay. I will not pretend I did not cry a little at that dinner table, because I did, and I am not ashamed of it. Walter reached over at one point and put his hand on my shoulder, the same gesture he had used the very first time he asked me to come work for him 12 years earlier, and he said, quietly, that he was proud of the man his daughter had married, and that he only wished he had said it more often while there was still an easy chance to. Vanessa held my hand under the table the entire meal, and Josie, oblivious to the emotional weight of the moment the way children beautifully are, kept asking if there was going to be cake. There was cake. There is always, eventually, cake, if you are patient enough and stubborn enough to let forgiveness do its slow, quiet work instead of letting bitterness do its fast, destructive one. I think about that Tuesday morning often, the cardboard box, Ray's downcast eyes, the cold numbness in my chest as I sat in that parking garage trying to make myself start the car. I do not think about it with anger anymore. I think about it as the moment my family, imperfect and frightened and human as they are, had to choose whether fear or love would define them, and eventually, however painfully, they chose love. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Our community grows because people like you believe that forgiveness is not weakness, that dignity does not require revenge, and that even the deepest betrayals can become the beginning of something better if we are brave enough to meet them with grace instead of bitterness. I did not write this story to make anyone in my family look like a villain, because none of them are. They are simply people who let fear override love for a little while, the way all of us are capable of doing if we are not careful, the way perhaps some of you reading this have done to someone you love, or had done to you. What I hope you take from my story is simple. However badly someone hurts you, however unjustly you are treated by people who should have protected you, you always still get to choose who you become on the other side of that hurt. I chose forgiveness, not because my family deserved it easily, but because I deserved to be a man who could offer it freely, and because somewhere out there, 600 families were counting on a decision I made not out of self-interest but out of love for people who never even knew my name. That, I have come to believe, is the quiet, unglamorous heart of every second chance worth taking, and I hope, whatever betrayal or heartbreak you may be carrying today, that you find the courage to take yours too.